Good morning. So, since I'm going to talk about the question of basically whether we should go by reason all the time or whether we should make allowance for accepting things on faith, I want to start with an example of a situation where I think most people will agree on what the answer to that question is. And it's actually kind of funny that I chose this example many weeks ago, and now I actually have a cough today. But imagine there's a situation where you're suffering from a persistent cough. So it's not just like you've had a cold for a couple of days, but it's something that won't go away after many weeks. And you decide, might be a good idea to go have a doctor check that out. And so you're on your way to the hospital, and some complete stranger accosts you and says, you really shouldn't rely on traditional Western medicine. What you should try instead to fix that persistent cough is crystal healing. I'm not sure if you know exactly what crystal healing is or is supposed to be, but they take some pretty stones, they put it at strategic parts of your body, and that's it. And they'll tell you, well, these crystals, they interact with your chakras. Your chakras are invisible energy centers, strategic parts of your body, allegedly. But this person who's approached you, they seem very nice. You don't want to be disagreeable. You don't want to make a fuss, so you say, okay, I'll try that out. And you try it out, and the cough doesn't go away, surprisingly. In fact, your symptoms get worse. But the person on the street who's decided to do the crystal healing with you says, no, it only works if you stick with it. And again, you don't want to disagree. So you stick with it, and you die. Because it was lung cancer, and you really should have gone to see a doctor. I think this is the kind of case where most people are going to say, you shouldn't be so credulous, you shouldn't be so gullible. Why do you believe what this stranger, this random stranger says? You shouldn't go on faith, you should be rational about something where your life is in danger. I think most people will agree about that kind of situation. And yet, there are millions of people in the modern West today who believe certain kinds of things on grounds no better than that in any number of different ways. So, for example, I know it's Sunday morning, but there are millions of people, I imagine both in the United States and here, who think that this piece of bread is actually a piece of the flesh of their Savior. There are people who think that this piece of bacon, even if it's been inspected by the best scientists, think that it is impure and not to be eaten. There are others who think this piece of steak, even though it looks like it's pretty nutritious, will say not that it's impure, but that it's holy and that you shouldn't eat it. These are all claims that are accepted on faith, no better than the belief in the power of crystal healing. And so the question that I want to discuss today is why is this not a good idea? Why should we go by reason and all the time? And to understand the answer to that question and Ayn Rand's answer to that question, I want to first give some definitions, because it's often the case that the terms of the discussion are unclear. What do we mean by reason, and what do we mean by faith? So let's start with reason. I'm going to give a kind of informal definition here, but I think this captures, in essence, what I'm going for, where reason is the human power to conceptualize observable evidence and draw inferences from it. So this is a picture of Isaac Newton, or a model pretending to be him, and he's experimenting with the prism to separate out the spectra of light. He did important experiments proving the composition of light with prisms. reason is the basic tool that Newton is using to do these experiments. And it's the same tool that science, in its most celebrated way, uses to discover truths about nature. But one thing that I think is important is that reason is not only a tool of scientists. It's not just some special device that we take out and polish up when we need to do especially important things. It's something that every one of us uses every day when we're trying to discover basic facts about the world, when we're trying to discover basic cause and effect connections. It was used by the most primitive of people when they observed that seeds grow into plants, and when then on that basis they discovered and invented the use of agriculture. So that's what I mean by reason. I mean the faculty that allows us to look at the world and figure things out about it. What I mean by faith is accepting things without any basis in observational evidence. Without any basis in observational evidence. So basically I'm defining faith as the negation of reason, as not going by reason, as not going by your senses and what you can infer from them. So if you accept something as true, just because it's written in this religious text, or just because you hear it from a stranger on the street without a good reason to believe them, that's faith. Now, faith is a term that's used in many different ways. And just like some of the terms we talked about yesterday, like selfishness, where it's often offered to you as a kind of package deal. You're doing it for yourself, but you're also then therefore doing it at the disregard of others. Many people use faith as a kind of package deal. And I want to try to unpackage that today. I want to mention one particular confusion that I think people have about the idea of faith. They'll often understand it to mean anything that you accept as true from another person. But that is a very ambiguous way of defining faith, because there are many different things you could mean by that. So consider, for example, just the difference between accepting what your doctor tells you and accepting what that crystal healer tells you. There's a really big difference. In the best cases, there's a really big difference between those two. In the case of the doctor, there's a whole lot that you know about the doctor that gives you reason to trust them. You know that they went to a medical school that has some reputation. You know they work at a hospital that has some reputation. You know people who've been to that doctor or to that hospital and who've been treated and who've, improved because of the treatment. And I think most importantly, the doctor's able to explain to you their reasons for thinking that there's something wrong with you and why they think the treatment they're proposing is going to help. Like they can show you the x-rays where they see the growth in your lungs, and you can understand why that shouldn't be there, and it might interfere with your breathing eventually, and you need your lungs to live, and so something needs to be done to that growth. It needs to be shrunken, or it needs to be cut out. You have all kinds of reasons to trust the doctor. That doesn't mean that the doctor's always right. It doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to be correct, or that you're guaranteed to get it right by trusting them. But if you don't get it right, going on the basis of what evidence you have, that's how you're going to fix your mistake. As opposed to the crystal healer, where you don't know who this person is, you don't know what their training or their education is, or whether they have any track record of succeeding and healing people with this. They're a random person off the street, and they certainly aren't able to explain to you why the crystals are going to be able to heal you. How are these little rocks on my chest going to somehow get the thing out of my lungs? And what are these chakras again? So there's a big difference between what you might call rational trust and faith. Rational trust is accepting another person's claim because you've got good reason to believe they know what they're talking about. And faith is just accepting something without any basis in reason. So you're often offered the argument, well, we have to go by faith because there's so much stuff we have to accept from other people. And that's true. You can't get by in the modern world without learning things from other people who know more than you do. But in the best cases, you have good reason to believe what some people are telling you if you know that they have the relevant authority, the relevant expertise. But that's not the case for the crystal healer. And we have a good reason, we have reason to define faith that way, because sometimes people do believe things without any basis in evidence. And there's a long tradition of defining faith in just this way. This is, I think, what the book of Hebrews is talking about when it says that faith is the evidence of things unseen, substance of things hoped for. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about faith. And so now the question is, why should we go by reason and not by faith? Well, if the question is, should I go by reason ever? At all? This is, I think, an easier question to answer because nobody goes by faith all the time. Nobody never uses their reason. If we plugged our senses and just turned off our mind all day, we would die in very short order. And I think that most people understand why, if you're trying to figure something out about the observable world, if you're trying to figure something out about facts of nutrition or engineering, the way to figure it out is to look at the world. And so the harder question for some people to answer and to grapple with is, should we go by reason all the time? Or should we go by reason, let's say, most of the time, but there'll be certain areas in our life where make an excuse for not having to have a good reason? There's lots of examples you could give of this. I like to give the example of Galileo and his conflict with the Church. This is Galileo on the right and Cardinal Bellarmine and the Inquisition on the left. And Bellarmine was no idiot. And he, I think, even considered himself to be a scientist. And he said, Galileo, do all the science you want. Do all the astronomy that you want. Just whatever you do, don't come to any conclusions that contradict the text of Holy Scripture. And so, theorize about the motions of the heavens all you like, but if you come to the conclusion that the Bible is wrong when it says or implies that the Earth is at the center of the solar system, you can't do that. But, I mean, this isn't just a relic of history. There are still people who try to make some kind of reconciliation between reason and faith to this very day. And I mentioned already the examples of the various dietary restrictions and beliefs, but, I mean, wouldn't you ordinarily think that it's the science of biology that studies the question of whether living beings can rise from the dead, or whether virgins can give birth? I mean, you'd think biology says this is not possible. We have no reason to think this is possible. But people who consider themselves to be scientific people will still say, I know I'm supposed to be scientific, but on this one thing, I'm going to leave some room for faith. So one question that I would ask of those who want to make that compromise is, well, how exactly are you going to do it? How are you going to balance reason and faith? How are you going to weigh the pros and the cons of when to go by reason and when to go by faith? And normally when you weigh pros and cons, when you consider pluses and minuses of what to choose in a given situation, that is itself a rational process. So what other cognitive mechanism are you going to use to decide whether you should go by reason? There is no third faculty. And so I think what this points to is the fact that as soon as you're allowing for a case where you're not going to go by reason, where you're going to make some special exception, whereas in the terminology that Onkar presented to us earlier, you're choosing to evade the facts. That's not itself a rational decision. In fact, that's a complete abdication of your reason and a surrender to faith. I think this is what Ayn Rand was getting at in a passage from an essay of hers, well, in a passage of a speech in Atlas Shrugged, where she says, "Reason is an absolute that permits no compromise. A concession to the irrational invalidates one's consciousness and turns it from the task of perceiving to the task of faking reality." But I want to focus especially on one aspect of Ayn Rand's support for reason and her critique of faith that I think is especially distinctive. And one of the reasons that I think it's important is because it's one that I had occasion to discover, at least in part, on my own before I even read any Ayn Rand. And so, especially on a talk about reason and faith, it's important that I'm not saying, accept this on faith from Ayn Rand, or from me. But maybe you've had the following experience yourself. Consider the question, why is it that different people believe in different religious texts? I myself grew up Catholic, Roman Catholic, came from a relatively Catholic family. Some of you know how Catholic they were. And considered myself to be a pretty strong believer until relatively into my late teens. Then I went to high school and I started meeting lots of different people. I met people from lots of different religions and different faith traditions, including not just Catholics, but obviously lots of Protestants and Jews and Muslims. And I got to know some of them, and I got curious about their religions and how they differed from mine, and so I started reading some of their texts. I read a big chunk of the Quran, for instance. And I didn't find it especially compelling. I didn't like, this isn't something I want to believe. But then I also noticed, well, it's very interesting. It's got a very coherent narrative to it, and it mentions certain things that are also mentioned in the Bible, but it takes a very different take on them. And so it accepts that Jesus Christ is a prophet, but it just doesn't think that he's the Son of God. And I started thinking, why is it that I accept this other book, but my friends accept the Quran? Is it because either of us have thought carefully about the reliability of the text, that we've looked at the historical sourcing of it, and we've checked the translations, and we think this is the most historical account? No. I think in most cases it's because this is just the text that our parents raised us with, which is a pretty accidental reason when you think about it for accepting a whole worldview. I mean, we have to trust our parents on a number of things, especially up until a certain age, but do we have reason to think that our parents are historical, theological, philosophical experts when they give us a text and we simply accept it? When I thought about that, I thought, I don't think I have reason to believe that about my parents, and I can't explain why I picked one text rather than the other. And that's a big part of the reason why I eventually gave up my religion and eventually became an atheist. So, I mean, I don't blame young people for believing what their parents raised them with, at least to a certain point. But the question is, what happens when they're old enough to realize their parents aren't right about everything, and the point at which they can start asking critical questions? I think this is the kind of point that Ayn Rand is getting at when she also says in a different passage in Atlas Shrugged, somewhere in the distant reaches of his childhood, when his own understanding of reality clashed with the assertions of others, a mystic is a man who gave in to so craven a fear of independence that he renounced his rational faculty. And now I want to speak just very briefly on the question of emotions, because here in this passage she mentions fear. She says someone believes on faith out of basically fear of disagreeing with another person, like disagreeing with that crystal healer or disagreeing with their parents. And indeed, Ayn Rand thinks that the deepest roots of faith are unscrutinized emotions, just like that. And the question came up in the last Q&A session of what about people who, when they try focusing, when they try engaging their reason, it seems painful for one reason or another. And does that stop them from doing it? And I definitely think there's a phenomenon there, and you can see it in this kind of case, where part of the reason why you don't want to look too closely at what these texts are saying or where they came from is because you're afraid of, let's say, disagreeing with your family. You're afraid of rocking the boat, and that can be painful. But, and this is really important, it doesn't have to be that way. The reason that you feel the fear is not inexplicable. Ayn Rand had the view that emotions are products of our thinking, of our past thinking. So, for example, if you feel afraid about something, it's because you think that there's some danger that you're facing. If you feel guilty about something, it's because you think you're doing the wrong thing. But the thoughts that your emotions come from could themselves be mistaken. And once you realize they're mistaken, if you do, your feelings will change. So you might at first be afraid of disagreeing with your parents, but is there a real reason to think there's danger there? If you disagree with them, are they going to abuse you or kick you out of the house? If there is, you should probably leave. But in many cases, there's not. And people assume that there's danger, but they don't actually test the waters to find out. Is there really a reason to think you're doing the wrong thing in disagreeing with your parents? Do you owe them that kind of blind obedience? And shouldn't they raise you to become an independent person? So our emotions come from our thinking, but we can challenge the thinking. We can change the thinking. The thoughts behind our emotions can be true or false. If we don't scrutinize our thinking, we get the kind of thing that Rand is talking about here. She says, an emotion that clashes with your reason, an emotion that you cannot explain or control, is only the carcass of that stale thinking which you forbade your mind to revise. But you're the one who forbade it. You're the one who is pretending like it's unalterable and it has to be there, but it doesn't. So I'm just going to close with a summary that I think connects this whole question to the overall theme of the conference, the individualism versus collectivism, by trying to emphasize that in Rand's view, and I agree with her, more than anything else, it's our reason that makes us an individual. It's using our reason, it's choosing to use our reason that individuates us most fundamentally from other people. If we judge the facts for ourselves, that's what allows us really to acquire knowledge and confidence. But if we give into faith, if we surrender into faith, we're surrendering to fear of disagreement, and we are leashing ourselves to the opinions and the dogmas of other people. That's how people become members of tribes and collectives. So should we go by reason or by faith? I think there's every reason in the world to think that we should go by reason. So thank you. Now ready for some questions. Oh, and I should remember just one last thing. We've been giving you some tips to follow things up if you want to learn more. I told you about the app. I told you about our local sponsors. We have a conference in Atlanta where we're going to be covering more of these issues. That's in October. And most especially, I want to mention the Objectivist Academic Center. This is a class where this is an online education program where if you're interested in taking a really deep dive into some of these more fundamental questions in philosophy from an objectivist perspective, you can sign up to take classes online. And Ankar is one of the lead instructors. I am. Keith is. There's a few other people. So, thank you.
Hi. In a case of like a terminal disease, wouldn't you think like a rational decision to, I don't know, like in a case in which the doctors can't help anymore, the reason can't help anymore, and maybe appealing to faith would be like a last chance to make it, like to find a solution, because believing that the faith could help you maybe would change the mindset and have some kind of like positive consequence in your body and just change the course of your disease.
It wouldn't work for me.
Yeah, because you have to believe. But like rational, if you believe that maybe it was a possible thing to happen.
So I think this is a kind of tricky situation where if you're a doctor and you're dealing with a patient, and let's say they're in a critical situation, and they're holding on for dear life. There is such a thing as a placebo effect, where people, positive thinking can, in marginal cases, possibly make a difference. I don't know what I would do if I were a doctor in that situation. It wouldn't work on me. And I think one of the issues here is if you're dealing with somebody who's in the last breaths of their life, the reason that reason is of value for anyone is because it's the faculty that allows them to survive in the long term. If there's nothing that you can do to help a person survive, then there's no prescription really for what to do. But at the end of the day, I don't think that you help a person by blinding them. And if anything, if the odds are the person is really got no chance of recovery, from a certain perspective, what they really need in the last moments, they need to accept that fact so they can put their affairs in order. They need to accept that fact so they can say goodbye to their loved ones. Now, if they're so out of it that they don't understand even what's going on, there's not even an issue anymore of whether they're able to go by reason or by faith. But for reasons Ankar discussed, they're not. If their brain is damaged, they're not in control anymore. And at that point, you just do what you can to keep them out of pain. Okay. But if they really are still in possession of their faculties, I don't think you're helping them by blinding them to the inevitable. I think they need to accept that.
Okay, thank you.
Bom dia, com licença. Sim, é só para complementar. Não, tudo bem.
Hi, I want to hear comments from you about your thoughts on principles and values and the formation of children and community and upsides and downsides for children and the importance of religion for communities and so on. So upsides and downsides. What are your thoughts on that? Do you understand?
Are you asking a question about what should a parent do to inculcate reason and discourage faith, or is it important for a parent to encourage reason and discourage faith when they're raising a child?
The opposite. If you take out religion and you don't have anymore the principles, the values that religion offers, what do you put in instead of religion? In the formation of children, if you don't have the community anymore, what do you have instead of that?
Right. Well, implicit in your question, it almost sounds like the assumption that if you abandon religion and can't instruct your children in some religious tradition, that you're thereby abandoning the possibility of some kind of moral instruction. And I think that's very far from the truth. And that's part of what our discussion from yesterday was all about. At least in Rand's view, morality is a rational science. And there are moral principles that are founded on rational observations of the world. And we talked about a number of them yesterday. I mean, the basic issue is that what's good or bad for you to do is what's, at the end of the day, biologically good or bad for your life. And the most important biological tool of survival that you have is your reason. And so the first, I think, and most important thing that a parent needs to instruct their children on is the importance of using their mind to figure things out and encouraging them to be independent. That's an important value, and all the other important values follow from that. The importance of being honest. Why do we need to be honest? Well, because if you just try faking, both in your own mind and in what you present to other people, you're making reality into your enemy. I talked about justice in another question that somebody asked me. We could talk more about other virtues, but the important thing here is that, and it's also not my view that you give a child a copy of Atlas Shrugged to read. You have to teach by example. And the best way to teach by example is to encourage them to be, give reasons for what they think, and for you to give reasons for what you think, and to not just expect that they accept what you tell them on authority. Now, sometimes you can't explain. It's hard to explain complex things to kids, but you need to at least explain in whatever terms are possible. And I should also say that Ayn Rand herself had the view that something that's very important for the development of the moral character of young people is the presentation of a moral ideal that is typically found in art, in fiction especially. And there's, many young people grow up reading stories about people they admire and people who they find heroic, not even in the stories they read, but just in like the sports heroes that they see. And that's very important, to have role models and heroes, and eventually then in the best cases, I think, to link it up with a philosophic understanding of a rational secular morality. So I hope that addresses your question.
Hello, good morning. Thanks, Ben, for your lecture. Ayn Rand's philosophy says that moral and values are objective. So in that manner, how could such abstract and intangible objective qualities arise from material stuff of the universe? Even if they somehow could, wouldn't morality be arbitrary or relative? We see all kinds of behavior happen in the animal kingdom, like an animal copulates with other, it doesn't rape it. Animal kills another, it doesn't murder it. How does purpose itself emerge on a purposeless universe? Thank you.
You and I had a conversation about this yesterday, so I came prepared. So it's definitely the case that not every capacity that we evolve biologically is one that we ought to use. And the most important capacity that we evolved is our rational mind. And as Ankar discussed, our rational mind works volitionally. We can choose to turn it on or off. So when you appeal to biology as a foundation, when you appeal to human biology as the foundation for ethics, you're not saying that your moral value code is somehow programmed into you. Far from it. The only thing that's relevant that's programmed into you is your rational capacity. But as Ankar has emphasized, it doesn't come with any content. It doesn't come with any knowledge. You need to figure out facts about the world, and you need to figure out what values are going to guide your actions. And you need to figure it out by making observations of the world, learning how, what courses of action are necessary for you to thrive and be happy. And so, how do you do that? Well, I've indicated to some extent already. When you make observations about how important your reason is to your survival, that's not arbitrary. There's thousands of years of history testifying to the fact that when human beings engage their minds and try to figure things out about the world, the result is success and prosperity. And when, like in the Dark Ages, they retreat into mysticism and faith, you have poverty and you have war and you have terror. So there's thousands of years of historical facts to attest to the importance of this point. It's not arbitrary, and it's not relative in the sense of it's something that is only true because somebody believes it. Whether I like it or not, the fact is that the Dark Ages were a period of faith and mysticism. Whether I like it or not, the Enlightenment was a period in which reason led to prosperity and progress. So this isn't just something that someone's making up. These are objective facts. And then the task of moral philosophy is to work with that basic point. If reason is our basic means of survival and success, then we need to figure out, well, what are all the other things that we need to make our reason work? What are the requirements of reason? And that's where each of the basic moral values and virtues in Ayn Rand's theory of morality come from. Honesty, integrity, justice, independence, productiveness, pride. These are all special, important requirements of having a functioning, rational mind, living as a human being on this earth. And it's a longer question, longer discussion about why exactly that's true for each of them. But that's the outline of the view. Why?
Thank you.
This is objective. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Congratulations on your explanation. It was really nice. And talking about objectivism, I'd like to know what would be like the biggest difference between religious society in a capitalist system and an atheist society in the capitalism system, and which one would be better in the objectivist view?
Well, I mentioned that I was an atheist, and Ayn Rand was an atheist as well. And I mean, I'm not an atheist just because Ayn Rand is one. I told you I was already very skeptical about religion well in advance of reading her. And so there's a much longer discussion to have about why strict adherence to rationality and why elimination of faith from your belief system implies atheism. I think it does. I mean, there are arguments that you can give for the existence of God. There are many arguments that philosophers have given over the years. I'll say two things about them. One is that I've looked at them, I don't think they work. The other is that I don't think most people who believe in God actually believe in God because of any of these arguments. They might trot them out in conversation to try to justify their views, but if you go back to why is it that they believe in God originally, it's because of some variation of this is what I was raised to believe by my parents. And you sometimes ask them, well, if you've decided that this argument didn't work, if you found a logical flaw in it, would you keep believing in God? And often they'll say, yeah. So there's a longer conversation to have about why being loyal to reason implies atheism. But I think it does. And then the question is, well, if it's a choice between an atheist society and a religious society, especially if both of them are capitalists, then I think that atheism is the more rational view. Now, there's lots of questions to still discuss there, because and often they'll relate to the topic of the previous two questions, which is, well, if everybody's an atheist, then where do you get your moral guidance from, and how would that society be any better? But I reiterate the point that assumes that there is no secular rational basis for morality, which I think you can demonstrate that there actually is. So I don't know if there was an issue behind that question for why you were asking it that maybe I haven't addressed. I kind of sensed that there was.
No, it's because, the biggest country, like in economic terms, is the United States, and it's a really religious country. And, the biggest atheist country in this world is a communist dictator, China. So we haven't had in the world like an atheist capitalist society.
I see. Yes, I suspected that might have been what you were after. So, I think a big part of the reason why the United States is recognized as a religious country is because we have such strong protection for religious freedom. And properly so. I think that is an implication of the principles of the Enlightenment, that if you believe in intellectual freedom, then you protect the right of people to believe and practice what they want, as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of others. And that's not because, I think the Enlightenment accepted, it's not because these religious views are all so great. It's rather that understanding the importance of protecting intellectual freedom means respecting people's decision to make mistakes, even when they are mistakes. So I think that's why America is so religious, comparatively. All the persecuted religions of the world came to America. But I think that America has succeeded, not because of, but in spite of its religious freedom, especially because the same religious freedom grants protection to atheists and secularists, and however many scientists that may include. And I do think, though, that there is a contradiction at the founding of America. For those who thought that our rights were God-given, for those who thought that the importance of freedom of every kind comes because it's endowed by a creator, as long as that's been held seriously, it has undercut freedom in America. Because if you think that morality doesn't come from God, if you think rights don't come from God, and you think God has to be accepted on faith, there's a very short path from believing in the importance of faith to believing in the importance of force and to using force, because reason and freedom are connected. The reason why protecting people's freedom is so important is because people need freedom to use their rational minds. If you think, though, that the mind isn't so important, doesn't need to discover things for itself, it's hard to see why using force is so wrong. And indeed, I think that to the extent that religious philosophy has dominated politics in America, it has been anti-freedom and consequently anti-capitalist. So we need to make that separation all the way, I think.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Bom dia, desculpa pela interrupção anterior, mas eu gostaria de fazer um comentário com relação à primeira pergunta, que como médico nós vemos que os pacientes que apresentam um estado de espírito, de otimismo, né, eles melhoram o nível hormonal, o nível imunológico. Então eu acredito que a fé às vezes funciona nesse sentido, não com relação a alguma coisa sobrenatural, mas sim melhorar o estado de espírito, enfrentar com alegria, com otimismo, e melhora a resposta ao tratamento do paciente. Então, com certeza não é nada sobrenatural, mas sim um estado de espírito daquele paciente que pode se beneficiar através da fé ou da razão, depende de cada pessoa. Obrigado.
Okay. I'll just say two quick things in addition on this question. One is that it's certainly not my view that it's the place of the doctor dealing with a religious patient to crusade for atheism or something like that when they're in the midst of giving treatment. So that's not their job. But I will add that I think the implicit assumption of your question is that faith is a source of optimism. And I don't think that's true. I think that, and for reasons that came up in the last Q&A session with Onkar, what are you doing when you shut off your mind, when you evade, when you choose to evade? What you're doing is you're telling yourself, I'm not competent to deal with the world. And if you then help someone to have faith, You're telling them you're not competent to deal with the world. I think that kind of move is guaranteed to undercut someone's self-esteem and confidence, and in the end, that is not conducive to optimism. Thanks. Do we have any others? Looks like not. So thank you very much.